Okay, so today we're going to go through the calibration procedure for a model Q2, which measures oxygen and carbon dioxide. So as you can see right now, our readings are 21.5 and 0.3, which is close for room air, but not exactly where we want them to be. So the first thing we're going to do is check to make sure that the sample probe is screwed in fairly tight. It should be pretty tight with your hand, and then we're going to hit the pump button. We want to make sure that the pump time is at least 5 or 6 seconds, long enough to draw in a sample, and then we're going to watch the reading change. So room air should read 20.9, and you can see that this is going slightly above that. So the way I'm going to adjust the oxygen is I'm going to go to the side here to this first potentiometer, and I'm going to turn that slightly down, and I'm going to watch the oxygen reading, and it's going to read 20.9. And so I know that that's set correctly. Also, the CO2 should read 0.1 or 0 in room air. So in this case, to adjust the 0, I'm going to go to the fourth span potentiometer. This is the CO2 0. And I'm going to turn that slightly. Oh, we're going the other direction. And if you go the wrong direction, it's not a big deal. You just turn it back the other way. So we're going down to 0.2 and 0.1. That's pretty good, so I'm going to leave it right there. So now we have it set at 20.9, 0.1, and we're going to go ahead and perform a calibration for the CO2. I'm just fine-tuning the 0 here a little bit. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so we're at 20.9, 0.0. The next thing we want to do is calibrate the CO2. To do this, we're going to use a calibration tube, which is just a blunt needle with some tubing connected to it. It's about 4 inches long. It's very important to use something like this, because if you were to use, for example, just a needle like this that doesn't have any tubing connected to it, what's going to happen is when you go to put this in the calibration tube, you risk getting some room air sucked inside the needle. So with a longer piece of tubing like this, what we can do is we can connect here and make sure that that connection is snug, and then we can really put it far inside the calibration tube here, without creating a firm seal, because of course if you were to connect these together and create a seal there, you would risk pressurizing the sensor, which you don't want to do. So I'm going to calibrate with something that's in the middle of the range. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to find a 50% standard, and I'm going to get that flowing out of the tank, and then we're going to, with the 50% CO2, we're going to go ahead and hit the pump button. And we're going to watch the reading start to change. Now you notice that the oxygen is going down, which makes sense because this is a 50% CO2 standard in nitrogen, and the CO2 reading is going up, hopefully towards 50%. It doesn't hurt to pump it a second time because you're just making sure that the air gets drawn through. So now we'll let it stabilize. While that's reaching its final reading, we're just going to turn the cylinder off. Okay, great. So if we look at the oxygen reading, it should be reading 0. It's reading 0.1. If I wanted to adjust that, I would go to the second potentiometer here on the side. This is the 0 adjust for the oxygen. And if I wanted to go up, I can turn it like that. And if I wanted to go down, I could turn it like that. So in this case, I'm going to set it to 0.0, which is where it should be. And 51.5 is where the CO2 stopped. So the span pot for the CO2 is the third pot here. I'm just going to turn that ever so slightly, and I'm going to get that right down to 50%. And if it bounces around a little bit, 0.1, 0.2, that's not the end of the world. You just want to get it as close as possible. So that's good at 50.0 or 49.8. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to check one more point. So we're going to go ahead and check 100%. So right here, I'm going to turn on my 100% CO2 tank. And the oxygen should, again, stay pretty close to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and pump this at 100%. And the oxygen is staying at 0, which we expect. and this is climbing up towards 100. So we're going to wait for this to stabilize and see where it ends up. Okay, and there we are. It's up at 100.4. It's stabilized, and that's exactly what we expect. That's a great reading. And so now we can consider this calibrated, and if we want to go back to room air, we simply disconnect the tube and we pump in the room air, and the CO2 should start dropping back to 0, and the oxygen should go back up towards 20.9.